earlier today. In this special programme, Anthony Howard looks back on Harold Wilson's life and his contribution to shaping modern Britain.
Only 3 men have led the Labour Party to victory in its entire history: Ramsay MacDonald, Clement Attlee and Harold Wilson. Of this trio, Wilson was the most successful. Prime Minister for 7 years, 9 months in all, he maintained his party in power for longer than anyone this century, apart from Margaret Thatcher.
He had an eel-like quality. He could always wriggle his way out of a difficulty, and he did it in order to keep the show on the road.
Although he was an economist, I think maybe it was on the cultural side that he has as much influence on the way Britain went in the 60s and the 70s as anybody else.
As a party leader, I'd rate him almost at the top. The unity of the party was his overwhelming consideration. That set limits to what he could be as a Prime Minister, because in the end I think he set the unity of the party above even the national interest.
He never much believed in ideology, you know. He was essentially an operator.
Bridge in the Colne Valley in the West Riding of Yorkshire, the birthplace of James Harold Wilson. He was actually born at 4 Warnford Road, Cowersley, a modest terraced house into which his father and mother had moved in 1912. Harold was 6 years younger than his sister Marjorie. He was the apple of his parents' eye.
He came from not a working class family, but a lower middle class family. His father was an industrial chemist, and he was always deeply rooted in his childhood in Yorkshire.
The nearest big town was Huddersfield, and the young Harold became a devotee of its football team, doing very well at the time. He went with his father to virtually all of its home matches. The other fixed point in his life was the local Baptist chapel. He went there to Sunday school every week, though the family was really Congregationalist. At the age of 4, he started going to New Street Council School, and he was to stay there until he was 11.
Well, Harold was an efficient, methodical, ambitious young boy. He could have succeeded at anything.
In 1927, he won a county minor scholarship to Royds Hall Grammar School in Huddersfield. It was a good school, and in the normal course of events, he could have expected to spend the rest of his school days there. But in 1930, at the age of 16, Wilson left Royds Hall School and Huddersfield, never to return. His father had lost his job. The family moved to Cheshire, where his father, who had been out of work for 16 months, had found a new job.
In 1930, the world was somewhat shattered, mine in particular. Harold had a very severe attack of typhoid fever, which he was in critical condition for weeks. With careful nursing, he came round. Just when he recovered, I became unemployed at the works I was at.
Father worked in a dye works. Then he was out of work. And of course things were very difficult. Now somebody or other afterwards in a meeting of parliamentary said, "Why do you think Harold made such a good Prime Minister?" I said, "Because we had a father out of work and we knew what it was to have to do things very, very carefully."
The move to Cheshire proved very fortunate for Wilson. The Wirral Grammar School, where he went, had been open for only a year, and he became its first sixth form pupil, getting what in effect was private tuition from its deputy headmaster. but he had other interests besides the purely academic.
I probably remember Wilson best through his association with the Scouts here. We started a company with the younger boys, and he threw himself wholeheartedly into the work, and as troop leader, and we relied on him a great deal, and he never let us down. Eventually, of course, he became a King Scout, the first one we'd had, and we were very proud of that, an achievement of which I'm sure he's proud too.
In 1934, he won an open exhibition to Jesus College, Oxford. The Oxford of the 1930s was very different from that of today, and in those days it was quite a triumph for a grammar school boy to get there. Jesus was a modest, unpretentious college, untouched by the spirit of Brideshead, and Wilson soon felt at home there.
Harold Wilson and I came up to Jesus College as undergraduates in the same year. We both lived on the same staircase. As an undergraduate, he had a tremendous capacity for hard work, and he imposed upon himself a rigid discipline, as for instance, as far as the number of hours a day he had to work. And if he didn't come up to that standard, he was never very pleased with himself.
He was at Oxford when I was there before the war, but he showed no interest in politics whatever then. He didn't join the Labour Club like I did, still less the Communist Party as I did.
When I was a Labour councillor in Oxford and Labour candidate for the city, I was not aware of Harold Wilson playing any part in Labour politics. I didn't know of his existence.
He took a first-class degree in politics, philosophy and economics, the best of his year, and soon came under the wing of the distinguished academic Sir William Beveridge, who got him a research fellowship at University College, of which he was master. In 1939, when war broke out, Wilson did not join the forces, but instead was recruited to Whitehall, thus escaping the call-up. Working for the Churchill coalition, Wilson rose rapidly, ending up as head of statistics at the Ministry of Fuel and Power.
He was a brilliant civil servant, a wartime civil servant, did all the figures on coal stocks. And he brought to government a knowledge of the mechanism of government, which was quite unique. Very few people would have that advantage. And I think that gave him a head start as an extremely young MP, because he was never a backbencher till he retired.
The first post-war election saw a great Labour landslide. Wilson became a Member of Parliament for the first time, comfortably gaining the Lancashire seat of Ormskirk. He immediately got a junior ministerial job as Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Works, and 2 years later was promoted to be Secretary of Overseas Trade. But his real break came when at the age of 31 he was catapulted into the Cabinet as President of the Board of Trade in succession to Sir Stafford Cripps.
When Stafford Cripps was promoted to the Treasury, he said to me, "Well, Barbara, you won't want to come to the Treasury, too dull for you. That Harold Wilson is going to succeed me as President of the Board of Trade, so you could be with Harold." And I said haughtily, "I am not a chattel to be handed from one minister to the other, thank you very much." Well, Harold must have heard of this, because he sent for me and he said, "Please, Barbara, would you remain as PPS and do me a favour?"
It didn't take long for him to make his mark.
I have just come here straight from the House of Commons, where I have just announced the ending of the clothing rationing scheme. This doesn't mean that we are going to slow up on our export drive for clothing or for textiles. It does mean that the supplies that are available will now be open to all to buy in the shops without having to surrender coupons.
In the 1950 general election, he fought the new constituency of Huyton, just outside Liverpool, scraping in by only 800 votes. But Wilson had not finished with living dangerously. In April 1951, he joined the idol of the left, Aaron Bevan, in walking out of the Attlee cabinet. It was one of the first great Labour rows. Bevan and Wilson wanted to see cuts in defence rather than impose NHS charges. No longer a rising star, he was now at 35, an ex-minister. Not that it mattered much. Within 6 months, the Labour government had lost the 1951 general election.
And as Mr. Churchill arrives at Woodford to hear he's re-elected, he knows who will be called on to form a new government.
When Attlee retired, there wasn't much room for Wilson in the new Labour leadership, consisting of the leader, Hugh Gaitskell, the deputy, George Brown, and the chief whip, Herbert Bowden.
Harold was hated by the Gaitskillites. I think Hugh Dalton used to call him Nye's little dog. And he was isolated and marginalised and left out and somebody of no account. And it was during those years in the wilderness that he formed friendships, especially with those who had been loyal to him.
The truth was that Gaitskell's style was never Wilson's.
What sort of people do you think they are? What sort of people do you think we are?
Wilson did not believe that Gaitskell was right to practice the politics of confrontation.
Do you think that we can become overnight the pacifists, unilateralists and fellow travellers that other people are?
In November 1960, he even stood against Gaitskell, being defeated by more than 2-1 in a ballot of Labour MPs. But, as a cynic once said, in politics, while there is death, there is hope. And when Gaitskell died suddenly at the age of 56 in January 1963, Wilson inevitably became a challenger for the succession. He faced two opponents, George Brown and James Callaghan, and after 3 weeks emerged triumphant. Was it, though, a victory for the left?
Harold has never was, a left-wing person. He managed at the appropriate time to persuade enough left-wing people in the Parliamentary Labour Party that he was their best bet, and that's how he got the leadership.
Wilson was lucky in that he became leader at a time when Britain was visibly changing. Irreverence was in the air, and the young, at least, were marching to a new beat. His informality was a clean break with the past and seemed wholly in tune with the new national mood.
He did what Tony Blair is now doing. He struck a new note.
In all our plans for the future, we are redefining and we are restating our socialism in terms of the scientific revolution. But that revolution cannot become a reality unless we are prepared to make far-reaching changes in economic and social attitudes which permeate our whole system of society. The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices or for outdated methods on either side of industry.
He turned out to be a brilliant speaker at party conference, and that was his first speech after becoming leader. And I think it generated tremendous enthusiasm because the Labour Party had been to some degree at a loss what to do because it had carried out the whole of its policy under the Attlee government between 1945 and 51, and it was looking for a new theme, and Harold gave it one in technology.
What he was saying was that if you don't plan technical change, we will all be burned up in technical unemployment. That's what he was saying. The white heat wasn't Mr. Wilson dashing around in a white coat with a blow lamp modernising the economy. It was warning us that if socialism had never been invented, it would be needed now to cope with technical change.
That summer had already seen the Profumo affair, involving the resignation of the War Minister over his relationship with a call girl. Suddenly there seemed to be something anachronistic, almost effete, about the whole ancien régime, the grouse-moor image, as Wilson called it, of the Tory party. It was perhaps the Conservative government's misfortune that its two most prominent members, Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister, and the man who was to emerge as his successor, the Foreign Secretary, the Earl of Hume, should both have seemed to reflect an out-of-date world so perfectly. The man who was determined to put an end to their rule travelled the country tirelessly with his entourage. It was a new style of campaigning which left nothing to chance. Even the humblest press release had to be cleared by the candidate himself.
There are parts of Wales, the West Country, where even in the boom, they have failed to produce full employment. Government are talking of putting them on the brake.
He was the producer, impresario and director of the whole show. By now, he had also become a considerable star in his own right, with a stand-up comic's sense of timing.
About a week ago, I saw the Prime Minister on television. It's a fact, I did. I'm just as much allowed to watch television as any of you. I have my favourite programmes as you have. And this wasn't one of them.
Wilson was quite extraordinary. If he decided to do something, he could do it. He decided to have a sense of humour. I think he's the only person I've ever known, possibly the only person who's ever existed, who decided to have a sense of humour.
The election campaign represented almost the development of a personality cult. Very anxious to show the popular touch that he thought the other party leaders lacked, Wilson threw himself into the American-style politics of pressing the flesh and working a crowd. He had already found the appropriate classless symbol in a Ganex Mac, and he wore it remorselessly, in public anyway.
Britain has just held a general election when 28 million people voted.
His reward came on October the 15th, 1964, when almost exactly 5 years after it had last returned the Tories to power, the nation voted to throw out the Conservatives and install Labour in their place, if only by a majority of 4. The seat that tipped the balance was Meriden in the West Midlands.
Could we, we haven't got the state of the party board on that just yet. This, of course, it was of critical importance, and it now does make it virtually certain, beyond all possible doubt, that the Labour Party will have its necessary 316.
And in the light of that success, what are they thinking down at Transport House? Peter Woon, come in.
Here we are. That's the feeling here at Transport House when that Meriden result has come through. That's the one they were waiting for. Now let's get a couple of quick reactions from some Labour Party workers. What's your thoughts?
Oh, immensely exciting after 13 years. It's just the sort of thing we've been waiting for.
And here, Sir Alec comes.
Are you ready
Prime
now
Minister.
to concede defeat?
I'm going to see the Queen.
Have you conceded defeat?
Well, the longest period of one-party rule in modern British history is now coming to an end. The 13 years of Conservative rule coming to an end at this very moment, as the Prime Minister is about to turn over the seals of office.
So, at 48 years of age, Mr. Wilson became Britain's new Prime Minister. Within 24 hours, he'd announced the members of the new cabinet. They came to number 10 Downing Street for the first cabinet meeting.
But as the new ministers assembled, some from the old unreconstructed Bevanite left, others from the former Gaitskellite hard right, what was the atmosphere like?
It was full of argument and debate. Was the sense of being at the really humming, dynamic centre of government. Harold positively contributed, perhaps almost too much at that time. But then he had a cabinet, well, people who had not had any experience in government.
He always was very anxious to have a generated titular majority. And if he didn't naturally have one, then he'd add people to the cabinet who he knew would go along with him.
I pointed out to him that he had half a dozen ministers whom everybody thought to be entirely useless. And he replied, "Yes, but you don't understand. The weakest members of my cabinet are those who are most loyal to me."
It was at first the archetypal left-wing government, believing that you could actually build a new Britain. Tower blocks at that moment were the most convenient tool to hand. There was also a keen interest in industry, with the new Prime Minister busy touring factories and by no means shy of being seen on the shop floor. So confident was the new government in its ability to bring about economic growth that it even produced a blueprint of how it was going to do it. Its architect was George Brown.
Now today, Britain's first national economic plan was published. It shows us just how we can pay our way in the world, how we can play the part we should continue to play in international affairs, and at the same time, how we can all enjoy a steadily rising standard of living. Now the plan is...
Deflation soon turned all such hopes into dupes. From the start, Wilson, whatever the difficulties at home, was determined to show that Britain still had a place at the top table. He became a regular visitor to Washington, where at first at least he was always greeted as a guest of honour. The truth was that he depended on Lyndon Johnson both to defend the pound and to help Britain out with what had become a pressing problem, the future of Rhodesia, where Ian Smith was threatening a unilateral declaration of independence.
I know I speak for everyone in these islands, all parties, all our people, when I say to Mr. Smith tonight, Prime Minister, think again.
Ian Smith refused to do so, and Wilson's failure to solve the Rhodesian issue was to haunt him throughout the rest of his premiership. There were 2 sets of negotiations at sea, but both proved abortive.
Oh, the way he handled Rhodesia was a tragedy. I once said to him, you know, Harold, if your talks with Ian Smith mean a sellout, I resign. And he gave me a typical Harold Wilson answer. He said, oh, of course, Barbara, I would too.
Here was a declaration of UDI, which challenged the very, principles of government and of Britain's position as the colonial power. He desperately wanted to succeed there, and it was a bitter disappointment to him that success simply eluded him.
The Labour government was also then coming under considerable criticism over American policy in Vietnam, where from 1965 onwards, the US administration increasingly piled on the military pressure. Many in the Labour Party looked on aghast as all the techniques of modern warfare were applied to bring the Viet Cong to heel. But the British government was too dependent on economic American goodwill to denounce what was going on. The youth of Britain suffered from no such inhibitions.
Harold used to say to me, don't you realise that the one thing the Americans are demanding from us is that we send in British troops to back them up, and I've always refused that. To his credit, that is true. And there was always something to Harold's credit, I don't make any mistake about that. But that wasn't enough.
Wilson's own military moment of truth came over Aden. It was the first east of Suez possession from which Britain withdrew, and the summoning of the legions back home over the next couple of years really meant the end of empire. It was certainly not what the Prime Minister had intended when he came to office.
I don't think he had a very powerful sense of direction, and he was extraordinarily over-optimistic about the situation, what I used to call the Walter Mitty factor. I mean, he said our frontier was on the Himalayas, for example, when there was war between India and China. He thought that the trouble with Smith in Rhodesia would be over in weeks, not months. And this, I think, vitiated his leadership and led people, I think, both in the country and in the party, to doubt his judgment.
He did have a great number of dreams of empire. And as it suited Lyndon Johnson to encourage those dreams of empire, to encourage Britain to maintain a world power, Harold Wilson got very easily into a position in which he was pursuing 2 incompatible objectives.
At home, though, the Wilson bandwagon rolled on. His government had survived with a tiny parliamentary majority for 18 months. Then, with immaculate timing, he called a general election for March the 31st, which resulted in a massive Labour majority of 97 seats.
Then he got this huge majority in '66, and it began going wrong then, really. The Seamen's strike, when he talked about politically motivated men, I thought we were all politically motivated. And the National Plan collapsed. And from then on, I think he was fighting an uphill battle.
The forward market is quite erratic today, so chaotic conditions here. We're 68.63, 93.88.
The sector of the front on which he was most vulnerable lay in the money markets. His personal policy of opposing devaluation at any price was first challenged in July 1966. A group of his cabinet colleagues insisted that Britain now needed to cut its coat according to the available economic cloth. But Wilson, who was on a visit to Brezhnev in Moscow, effectively put down the revolt when he got back to London.
The biggest mistake he made during the 64-70 periods we were in office was to not only to oppose devaluation, but to refuse to allow the cabinet to discuss it. When one or two ministers, Jenkins I remember was one, raised the issue, he was told, well, it's nothing to do with you.
I don't think it was a mistake, although I can see the case for devaluing them. The political circumstances were entirely different in those days. We were one of the two leading currencies in the international financial world. People held their reserves with us. To devalue was really a sin against the Holy Ghost at that time.
He did not want to have that association of labour with devaluation in that necessarily short parliament. So there was a balance then between economic and political considerations. But once in July 1966, the case, in my view, as I thought at the time, was overwhelmingly for devaluation and not for deflation alone.
When devaluation eventually came in November 1967, it was forced on the government, nor were things improved by the Prime Minister's own broadcast.
Tonight, we must face a new situation. First, what this means. From now on, the pound abroad is worth 14% or so less in terms of other currencies. That doesn't mean, of course, that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse or in your bank, has been devalued.
The press and public reaction was almost universally hostile, and it was Wilson who took the blame.
I just say Wilson must go. I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it? We lost millions of pounds in a week, which could have been saved if he'd done it earlier.
So who do you blame then?
I blame the government, of course.
You hold them personally responsible?
Certainly. Who else makes decisions?
He has wasted £250 million in 2 days by supporting a pound that he knew should have been devalued a fortnight ago.
That was the really important moment. It reversed and blocked, really, the whole thrust of Labour policy. And one of the lessons to be learned from Harold Wilson's experience is that if you haven't got the so-called macroeconomic policies right, i.e. competitive exchange rate amongst other things, any amount of microeconomic interference, merging and recreating and founding new industries and so on, will not see you through.
Certainly this policy and personal reversal had the effect of leaving the government adrift and driving the Prime Minister in on himself. He started to harbour suspicions of his colleagues and tended to see every man's hand as being raised against him.
To say that we lived as very close and friendly neighbours would be an exaggeration. Mostly the door, there was a connecting door, mostly was open, though there were occasional periods of frigidity when I noticed it was closed, on one or two occasions even locked. You could almost tell the political temperature from that.
Harold did see conspirators, I think, round every corner. My experience was that on many occasions Harold saw a conspiracy when there wasn't one. I don't believe that there was actually ever a very serious conspiracy.
One thing his critics had always fastened upon was his reliance on an inner group of advisers, what came to be known as his kitchen cabinet, headed by his personal and political secretary, Marcia Williams. She controlled every detail of his public presentation for the new television age, including the decision to use his famous pipe on screen.
And one of the reasons that he appeared later on holding the pipe was because he
had to have some use for this right hand, which otherwise would have been doing that the whole time. And the left hand would go like that on the face, and that had a double bonus because it had all sorts of other sort of wonderful, the wedding ring and the rest, you know, it all came out, wonderful picture of sort of the comfortable, marvellous, dependable family man sitting there with the comfortable pipe, reassurance. I mean, the images were really very effective.
I think Marcia Williams was a good influence on Harold Wilson. I think that she provided a backbone to the administration which it would otherwise have wholly lacked. I imagine, though I never saw that, that she was capable of hysterical storms, which must have been disagreeable for the people inside Downing Street. But without her, I believe the Harold Wilson years would have been even less satisfactory than they were.
In some ways, she was a very powerful, not only a powerful figure outside Harold's circle, but powerful in relation to Harold as a human being. I think a very, very, somebody whose good wishes he wanted, whose approval he wanted, and who he profoundly respected. And she deserved that respect. She was a very, very capable woman.
Even before devaluation, Wilson had been toying with the notion of bringing Britain into membership of the European community. It all started with a tour of the European capitals, of which Paris, from the point of view of Britain's application, was far the most important. But alas, the General at that time said no.
Unfortunately, Harold then seemed to be, as it were, trapped by his own words. He'd said so many things about how serious we were in our bid and so on, in the public speeches that led up to his reconnaissance and to his application, that he found it extremely difficult to withdraw thereafter.
His disappointment over Europe meant that Wilson badly needed to launch a new initiative. He soon found one in perhaps the most famous white paper of modern British politics, In Place of Strife, produced by the new Employment Minister. She and Harold Wilson shared a common purpose, the need to produce a plan for trade union reform and thus to pinch the Tories' close.
I produced In Place of Strife. He was thrilled. As soon as he read it, he became its devotee. Barbary said, "You haven't out-Heath Heath. You have out-manoeuvred him."
If Harold had succeeded in enacting the proposals in the In Place of Strife white paper, and if compulsory ballots had been imposed upon the trade unions before strike action, as together with that, as it were, instruction to pause in the process of strike for a 4-week period. If those two measures had gone through, I believe the Labour government would have been far stronger, not only in dealing with the trade unions and handling the economy, but much more secure with public opinion. And I think it's a terrible pity now, particularly looking back, and I didn't necessarily think this at the time, that he didn't get his way.
At the time, though, in a remarkable display of resilience and stamina, Wilson refused to be downcast and preserved his reputation as a cheeky chappie.
I know I'm speaking for the Chief Whip here as well as myself when I say that for the benefit of those who have been carried away by the gossip of the last 2 days, I know what is going on. I am going on.
Ironically, the failure of the Wilson government's scheme to reform the unions did not adversely affect its popularity. This was mainly due to the new Chancellor Roy Jenkins, who after 2 years' hard slog suddenly found the terms of trade turning in his favour. In his April 1970 budget, he could afford to sound almost indulgent.
Last year, and the year before, I had to explain why I was introducing a hard budget. This time I don't have to do that. While I certainly don't regard this one as a soft budget, virtually everything in it is a benefit.
The whole cabinet had been consulted about the election date, and Wilson called it for June 1970. As always, he was the centrepiece of the campaign, though some found his whole style and approach now more reminiscent of royalty than of a democratic politician. He suffered, though, one piece of bad luck.
Grabowski and West Germany driving forward. The good ball.
The quarter-final of the World Cup, which England had won in 1966, was scheduled to take place 4 days before polling. The match was full of drama, though not perhaps of the kind for which the Prime Minister had been hoping.
And the whistle's gone, and West Germany have beaten England and gained revenge for 66.
This is BBC One.
We ought to go to Robert Mackenzie now.
One more loss for Labour, and it has lost its majority in the House.
That loss is coming from Belper, over to now to Belper and Alan Hart.
Brown, George Alfred, the Labour candidate, 33,633. Stuart Smith, Dudley Jeffrey, the Conservative candidate, 35,000.
The election result may have been a surprise, but perhaps it was preordained. The Conservatives won, and Edward Heath replaced Harold Wilson as Prime Minister.
The campaign wasn't, frankly, a very brilliant campaign. It was too relaxed altogether. But it's very difficult to judge these things at the time. And who could have predicted that at 1 month adverse trade figures, you know, when we bought 3 jumbo jets or something like that, and therefore distorted the monthly figures for the balance of payments, would have occurred just at that time and with such a devastating effect.
He didn't expect to be defeated, and in the weeks that follow, when I saw something of him as a newly elected Labour backbench Member of Parliament, I saw him first of all demoralised in a way which I hardly ever saw him during even the worst days of the Labour government, and I saw him in a very bad temper, really ratty.
I certainly thought we were going to win myself until a few days beforehand, when one felt the atmosphere begin to change, as one does during the course of an election campaign. And I think he was rather surprised when we didn't. And he was determined after that to win the following election and to get his own back and to beat Ted Heath.
For the man who had been Prime Minister for 6 years, being leader of the opposition obviously offered more opportunity for leisure. And in the Sillies, Wilson enjoyed it. For the first year, however, most of his time was taken up with writing his memoirs, which made him a relatively rich man. But it was still not an easy time.
I think the period of opposition from 70 to 74 must have been the most unhappy and difficult that any Labour leader has ever experienced. Reasons for that: one, the party was falling apart in disagreement over common market policy. Second, the party moved radically to the left on the National Executive Committee, particularly led by Tony Benn with his ideas of a command economy. And thirdly, the trade union movement had not forgiven the Labour government for its attempts to legislate to reduce their powers.
Ted Heath's abortive Industrial Relations Act and the protests of the trade union movement enabled Wilson to some extent to mend his fences with the trade unions. But it was the 3-day week and the power cuts of the winter of 1973-4, the product of the government's confrontation with the miners, that prompted Heath to appeal to the country. At first, the omens for Wilson did not look good.
He dared not associate himself with my appeal because he knew that his own position, his own title of leader of the Labour Party, depended upon the support of the extremists who were hell-bent upon a strike.
I remember seeing him 3 days before the poll, and I was as sure as I could be that he felt he was playing out his last act in politics, that he'd go down to dignified defeat, and I think he would then probably have resigned.
But the election result proved a turn-up for the book. It was a virtual stalemate, with the Liberals, led by Jeremy Thorpe, almost holding the balance of power. Ted Heath invited Thorpe to number 10 and tried to do a deal.
I think it was quite a welcome relief to us. He was most anxious to claim the crown as soon as the result was declared, and I literally did hold his coattails and pull him back on that occasion. in order to let Mr. Heath try, because I didn't think Mr. Heath would succeed in getting Jeremy Thorpe and the Liberals with him. But I think I coined the phrase for that particular occasion. It's a very old phrase about let them swing in the wind.
By the evening of Monday, March the 4th, Harold Wilson was back in Downing Street. It may not have been a clear-cut electoral triumph, but it was certainly a sweet political victory.
Harold came out and said to me, let's go and listen to the news. Let's go and watch the news. And we went into the press room. We sat in front of this television set in the dark. And the news came on, and there was Harold waving to the crowds from number 10 as the newly re-elected Prime Minister. And he turned to me with a kind of bashful smile on his face and said, I still can't believe it.
Terry, could you make a note of this? Where is everybody? Terry, could you make a note?
He was certainly more laid back, even when it came to preparing his speeches.
Is it? Wait, no, where is it? No, it's page 9 or 10.
9 or 10 of his speech.
Yeah.
He said to me, using his familiar football images, I'm going to be a sweeper-up. I've now got a team of ministers who are all capable to score the goals themselves. He said that's quite different from 1964, when none of them had any experience.
I remember when the government was first formed in 1974, and when he brought into the cabinet people from different wings of the party, and he was saying they were all going to work as a unified, experienced team. He said, I buried all the hatchets in the number 10 garden, but he said, I know where I've buried them. I can dig them up if need be.
His first challenge was to try to resolve the government's position on Europe. He did it by means of a referendum held in June 1975. By 2-1, the country voted to keep Britain in Europe. Publicly anyway, it was another moment of vindication.
I have to say, having worked beside him throughout, I never, from beginning to end, was able to discover whether Harold Wilson was actually in favour of staying in or leaving.
I do think that by the time he became Prime Minister for the second time, he had privately decided that it was in Britain's interest to stay in Europe.
The issues in the common market are going to affect this country for 100 years ahead. By that time, no one will remember who Harold Wilson was, or Roy Jenkins. It's just possible they won't even remember who Robin Day was.
May I adhere to the marginally more important issues?
But then, as is the way with prime ministers, it was on to the next thing. Inflation was shooting up, and Britain was in danger of looking like a banana republic. With the European controversy behind him, Wilson took action. He went back to incomes policy with strict limits on pay increases for everyone.
£6 a week maximum. No scope for negotiating exceptions. Rough justice, but necessary.
Inevitably, it involved the cooperation of the trade unions and their leaders. Soon, Wilson had given the arrangements a new name.
The social contract means a fair division of our national resources, the fair sharing of sacrifices. It is not a scramble in which the big battalions and the powerful and the wealthy, on both sides of industry, or in finance, or in any other sector of the community, can exercise their power in order to get an unfair advantage.
It was to be his last throw in economic policy. For 6 months later, he confounded the political world.
We've just heard from our staff at Westminster that the Prime Minister, Mr. Harold Wilson, has resigned. He feels he has been leader of the Labour Party for long enough.
It came as a shock to everybody on that morning. And indeed, when I was first told about it the previous Christmas, I didn't believe it. And when he told me himself that he was going to do it a week earlier, I then was really rather shaken by the fact that he was going to retire.
I remember the cabinet meeting when they were told, and when he'd come back from the palace after telling the Queen, and by that time he had told Jim Callaghan, Dennis Healey, and I think Ted Short, and others knew the rumours, But I've never forgotten the absolute sort of, you could have heard a pin drop in that room. And then one of them was in tears, others were shell-shocked, and it was a very, very surprising occasion.
Easter was always his real date, because when I joined him as senior policy advisor in March 1974, he said to me, I want you to come in and set up a policy unit in Downing Street. He said, you'll need leave from the London School of Economics, where I was a teacher. He said, you'll need leave for 2 years, because I am going to retire in the spring at Easter, 1976.
There was one piece of unfinished business, his resignation honours, known as the Lavender List, after the colour of the writing paper belonging to Marcia Williams, on which it was said to have been written. It caused a storm.
The Lavender Honours List was preposterous. It included people who had very little claim to any kind of honour at all, and included some people who clearly were not supporters of the Labour Party. It showed, I think, at that point, how much Harold Wilson had lost his grip, because earlier he had always very well understood what the likely public and political reactions to anything he did would be.
The Lavender List managed to make Harold Wilson look sleazy. I think he wasn't. I think he did it in order to meet requests from friends. I think it was a situation in which he was absolutely wrong to put personal friendship ahead of his duty as Prime Minister, and I think it did him considerable damage.
Another shadow was to fall over his reputation in retirement. There had long been rumours about MI5's suspicions of Wilson as a communist, but it was Peter Wright, a former member of the Security Service, who first revealed just how paranoid the mood in MI5 had become. His book, Spycatcher, became a world bestseller.
There was a group of people in MI5, and associated with them some rather sort of way-out crazies involved in parts of the army, some of the journalists, some of the proprietors and so on, who really did start talking in loose ways about the possibility of a coup against the government and so forth. It went far beyond the normal democratic structures at one time. I think probably primarily, my impression is in '69.
His last political outing was at the Warrington by-election of 1981, where he supported the Labour candidate against Roy Jenkins, by then of the SDP, and seized the opportunity to take a crack at 2 other members of the original Gang of 4.
If you take Mr. Owen and Mr. Rogers, I never thought of them as cabinet calibre. I put Mr. Owen into my first government 3 weeks after he made a great attack on me. Well, I didn't mind. I mean, you know, we're all like that in the Labour Party. I didn't mind in the slightest. And he was a perfectly good junior minister. But I never thought of putting either of them into the cabinet.
It was now very much the voice of the elder statesman, though it was seldom heard, even in the House of Lords, where he went in 1983. The last decade of Wilson's life was spent in a twilight world, with his memory, so long his most formidable asset, virtually gone. He maintained an interest in education, only fitting for a politician who could claim to have been the godfather to a new sort of university.
If Harold Wilson had done nothing else in his life, the Open University would be a monument worthy of any man, and I think he should deserve the credit for it. He worked against all the opposition, and it was formidable to force that through, and it was a triumphant success.
He was determined that people who hadn't had the good luck like him, or me for that matter, to get scholarships to Oxford should have a chance to get degrees in later life.
What otherwise, though, was his legacy?
The breath of fresh air that he brought into British politics after 13 years of Conservative rule was most important, and he was the midwife of changing a great deal of our thought about this country, about our relationship with the Commonwealth, about the withdrawal from Suez, and about our entry into Europe.
I think Harold had a clear vision of what a modern Britain would look like. I think he was a man with no time for class distinction, a man who could see what class distinction had done to divide Britain and to hold it back. But he was not a man with the kind of overwhelming, sustained, simple vision that could unify the country.
It was very much a question of after me the deluge. I mean, I think a lot of dragon's teeth were sown in the Labour Party during Harold Wilson's leadership. And as is the case with dragon's teeth, the results came out afterwards, and you moved within 3 years of Harold Wilson giving up the leadership into a position in which the Labour Party became unelectable for a generation, for half a generation.
I have no doubt at all that if Harold Wilson had not suddenly and mysteriously resigned in 1976, we would never have lost the 79 election, and Margaret Thatcher would never have entered number 10 Downing Street.
His real legacy to the Labour Party was the proof that we could win. Now, this isn't something that could be organized for. It's not something that could be contrived, but it's something that did take place. And that's, I think, the memorial that will exist.
We enter this campaign with our programs and policies fully... The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution. I want to report to you tonight about the very grave situation in Rhodesia. Grave because... That doesn't mean, of course, that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse or in your bank, has been devalued. For the benefit of those who have been carried away by the gossip of the last 2 days, I know what is going on. I am going on.
BBC Two's Newsnight, which is already on the